The overwhelming stench of rotting flesh was so intense that even the seasoned courtiers, those accustomed to the grandeur and oddities of royal life, couldn't keep their composure. Some of them vomited right there in the royal presence. Dogs circled around the leaking fluids of King Henry VIII's coffin, their tongues lapping at the gruesome mess. In the next few moments, you'll learn some truly shocking medical revelations, evidence that proves Henry VIII's shocking transformation from a golden prince to a grotesque shell of a man. This is proof that historians have tried to hide for centuries, and these revelations come straight from newly analysed court physician records and forensic examinations of his actual remains. But let's rewind a bit and show you how England's most powerful king became this horrifying figure. I hope everyone helps me with a like and a subscription, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. What you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the Tudor dynasty, the same dynasty that gave birth to the man who executed 2 wives and reshaped the nation's religion. Yet this same king died in a way so terrifying and undignified that even his own government covered it up for over 450 years. Now, secret medical records have finally exposed the truth, starting with a jousting accident that would slowly rot him from the inside out. If this hidden history is something you've never heard before, do me a quick favour, hit that like button so others can discover it too, because I've got 3 mind-blowing revelations that will completely alter the way you view the Tudor dynasty. Picture this January 24th, 1536 at Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII is still relatively fit at 44 charges down the tilt yard on his massive warhorse. The crowd holds its breath as England's king takes aim at his opponent. The afternoon sun gleams off his specially crafted armour, each piece worth more than a common labourer's lifetime earnings. The ground shakes beneath the pounding hooves as 2 armoured titans race towards each other at breakneck sport speed. But something goes horribly wrong. The horses collide with the force of a modern car crash. Henry's enormous armoured body, 300 pounds of man and metal, crashes to the frozen ground. The crowd gasps in horror as they watch Henry's warhorse destrier, also in full armour, stumble and fall defectly on top of him. The tilt yard goes deathly silent. Courtiers freeze in place, too terrified to move. Is the king dead? Has England just lost its monarch to a mere sport? For 2 hours, Henry VIII lay unconscious. For 2 hours, England had no king. For 2 hours, Anne Boleyn, pregnant and desperately hoping for a male heir, waited in agony for news. 2 hours that would change everything. When Henry finally woke up, witnesses reported something deeply unsettling. His once bright eyes, full of intelligence and charm, now had a different gleam, something darker and more unpredictable. His first words weren't of relief or concern for his subjects. Instead, he flew into a rage, demanding to know why the tournament had been stopped. The charming Renaissance prince who spoke 4 languages, wrote poetry, composed music, danced until dawn, and debated theology with Europe's finest minds was no more. In his place, a paranoid tyrant emerged, one with violent mood swings that would terrorize England for the next 11 years. Modern neuroscientists now believe Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury to his frontal lobe, the area controlling personality and impulse control. The evidence is irrefutable. Before the accident, Henry had shown remarkable restraint for a monarch of his time. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for over 20 years before seeking an annulment. He had executed relatively few nobles compared to his predecessors. But after January 1536, executions became a daily occurrence. Just 4 months later, Anne Boleyn lost her head, and Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted advisor, would follow suit. The king's rages became legendary. Servants reported finding him sobbing uncontrollably, one moment, then calling for blood the next. But the brain injury wasn't the end of Henry's medical nightmare. The same accident that scrambled his personality also reopened an old wound on his leg, and this wound would never heal. This is where our story turns from tragedy to true body horror. Most people don't know that Henry had suffered a leg injury years before, probably from another jousting accident. It had healed, leaving only a small scar. But after the 1536 accident, that old wound tore wide open. In Tudor England, where antibiotics and an understanding of infection didn't exist, an open wound was often a slow death sentence. Now imagine living with open sores the size of tennis balls on both legs, not for days or weeks, but for 11 years. Constantly oozing pus, never fully scabbing over the pain, so excruciating that even the softest silk bedsheets would make you scream. Court physician Dr. Thomas Vickers. Secret notes hidden away in the Royal College of Physicians and only uncovered in the 1960s describe the gruesome nature of King Henry VIII's condition. His ulcers were not just painful, they were stinking, festering, and beyond measure. Henry's legs had to be drained daily, sometimes twice a day, with infected fluid filling bronze bowls that servants would rush to remove from the royal presence. But despite the unbearable pain and the gruesome sight, Henry ever the vain and paranoid monarch desperately tried to conceal the deterioration of his body. He designed special gutters with lead weights to apply pressure to the wounds, thinking it might close them. Instead, it cut off circulation and worsened the infection. To mask the unbearable stench, he drenched himself in costly perfumes imported from Arabia, mixing rose oil with ambergris. He even instructed his portrait painters to depict him with impossibly athletic legs, standing in that iconic power stance we all recognize. The infection didn't just ravage his legs, it slowly poisoned his entire bloodstream. Each day, toxins from the rotting tissue entered his circulation, traveling to his brain, liver, and heart. Modern medical analysis of the symptoms described in contemporary accounts suggests Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that continuously released bacteria and inflammatory compounds throughout his body. These toxins triggered a cascade of symptoms, transforming Henry's life into a daily nightmare. The pain was excruciating. Imagine the worst toothache you've ever had but in your legs, and never relenting for over a decade. The fever would come and go, leaving him drenched in sweat one day and shivering with chills the next. His appetite was erratic, swinging wildly between nausea and insatiable hunger. But the most devastating effects were neurological. The toxins crossing into his brain caused violent mood swings, often unrelated to his true feelings. One moment he might laugh at a joke, the next he would order the jester's execution. Paranoid delusions became all too common. He believed enemies lurked everywhere, convinced that his servants were poisoning his food, that his wives were committing adultery, and that foreign assassins were hiding in every shadow. By 1540, just 4 years after the jousting accident, Henry had executed his second wife, annulled his marriage to his third, and was already on the hunt for wife number 4. Catherine Howard, a young girl of perhaps 17, caught his eye. The contrast between them must have been grotesque. Here was a king so obese that he needed servants to lift him onto his horse, pursuing a teenager who reportedly found his advances so repulsive that she needed wine to endure his bed. But the worst was yet to come when the wounds finally turned septic. The year 1542 marked a terrible turning point. The ulcers, which had been manageable but disgusting for 6 years, suddenly worsened. Dr. Vickers' notes describe a disturbing change in the colour and smell of the discharge. What had once been yellowish-white pus turned green, then brown. The stench evolved from foul to something witnesses described as the very smell of death itself. During this period, Henry's weight skyrocketed. Unable to exercise due to the intense leg pain, he ate constantly to distract from his misery. He ballooned from an already hefty 280 pounds to well over 350. His armour, preserved from 1540 and displayed in the Tower of London, shows a 48-inch waist. But by 1545, new armour had to be commissioned with a 54-inch waist. Let that sink in. A 54-inch waist, that's wider than most modern refrigerators. To accommodate his massive bulk, the palace had to undergo modifications. Doorways were widened, and the construction marks still visible at Hampton Court show where floors were reinforced with extra beams after the king's weight caused dangerous sagging. Special chairs were built with removable arms because Henry could no longer fit between them. But it wasn't just the furniture that needed altering. His daily routine became an elaborate performance carefully concealed from public view. Henry would be dressed while lying in bed, a process requiring 4 servants to manage his massive limbs. A system of pulleys and slings was installed to lift him upright. Once in a sitting position, he would be transferred to a wheeled chair. I've got 2 more shocking revelations coming up about his actual death and the cover-up that followed. But first, make sure you're subscribed. I've got an entire series on Tudor conspiracies that historians don't want you to know. Hit the bell so you don't miss the explosive truth about Anne's execution. As his physical transformation became undeniable, so too did the deterioration of his mental state. By 1504, courtiers reported behaviour that went far beyond a mere bad temper and into the realm of madness. Henry was observed holding entire conversations with people who weren't there. He argued with his dead father Henry VII, defending his expenditure of the royal treasury. He called out for his mother Elizabeth of York, who had died when he was just 11. Most disturbingly, Henry interacted with the ghosts of his victims. Multiple witnesses reported seeing him stop mid-sentence during state business, his face draining of colour. He would stare at empty air and whisper, "No," Not now, or leave me." Before exploding in rage at his confused counsellors, one particularly detailed account from the French ambassador describes Henry suddenly screaming at an empty chair, ordering Anne Boleyn to stop laughing at him. His paranoia had reached staggering levels. He became convinced that his servants were trying to poison him through his leg bandages, and he would demand the pus-soaked dressings be brought to him for inspection, sniffing them suspiciously before allowing them to be burned. Henry even hired food tasters not just for his meals but for his medicines, forcing unfortunate servants to apply his ointments to their own skin, first as a test for poison. By Christmas 1546, Henry had become something barely recognisable as human. Contemporary accounts describe him as a massive figure propped up on his throne, unable to stand without assistance. His face had swollen to nearly twice its original size, his features distorted by fluid retention. His eyes, once a brilliant blue, now yellowish and bloodshot, sunk deep into pouches of discoloured flesh. The smell emanating from the royal person had become impossible to disguise. Despite pounds of perfume, regular burning of incense, and fresh herbs scattered on the floors, the stench of decay followed Henry wherever he went. Courtiers would discreetly hold Pomander's balls of perfume close to their noses when approaching the throne. Some of the more delicate ladies at court would excuse themselves to vomit after mandatory appearances before the king. Here's something that will shock you about how Henry tried to hide his condition. His final portrait, the famous Whitehall portrait that became the iconic image of Henry VIII, contains a devastating secret. When the painting was X-rayed in 1960 during restoration work, conservators discovered that the king's left hand, which appears to be gripping a simple cane, was originally painted, holding something else entirely, a wooden staff topped with a human skull. This macabre walking stick wasn't just a Gothic fashion statement. Henry had become so obsessed with death that he carried this grim reminder everywhere. He would tap the skull against the floor during conversations, a nervous tic that unnerved even his most loyal courtiers. The skull itself was rumoured to be that of a monk from one of the dissolved monasteries, though some whispered it belonged to one of his executed enemies. The portrait artist Hans Holbein had painted this disturbing detail accurately, but after Henry's death his son Edward VI ordered it painted over. The young king couldn't bear the thought of his father being remembered as the death-obsessed madman he had become. Court records from those final months of 1546 paint a grim picture of a court in terror. Henry's mood swings had become so extreme that courtiers developed an elaborate warning system. Pages would discreetly signal the king's mood using coloured ribbons, red for rage, black for depression, and white for the increasingly rare moments of calm. The king would fly into violent rages over the smallest provocations. A servant who sneezed during a royal audience was dragged away for interrogation, suspected of trying to assassinate him with poison powder. A lady-in-waiting who accidentally stepped on the king's robe was banished from court, her family's lands confiscated. Perhaps the most chilling development of all was that Henry began ordering executions of people who had already been dead for years. He had simply forgotten that he had ordered their deaths. One particularly disturbing incident occurred during a state banquet in November 1546. The French ambassador reported that in the middle of the meal, Henry suddenly stood up an action requiring several servants to help him, which visibly caused him great agony, and began shouting at an empty chair. Henry screamed, "You dare show your face at my table, witch," pointing at nothing. The court sat frozen as he continued his tirade, clearly directing his fury at what he believed was Anne Boleyn's ghost. "I took your head once, I'll take it again," he yelled. Then in a sudden moment of exhaustion he collapsed back into his chair, resuming his meal as if nothing had happened. It was a disturbing snapshot of the king's unravelling mind. January 1547, Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII entered his final decline, and what transpired next was so horrifying that his own government suppressed the records for centuries. The ulcers on his legs had worsened beyond anything his physicians had seen before. Dr. Thomas Wendy's suppressed medical notes, discovered in a private collection in 1891, described wounds so deep that bone was visible. The flesh around the ulcers had turned black, a clear sign of gangrene setting in. The smell was unbearable. Servants fainted while changing the king's bedsheets. Windows had to be kept open despite the freezing January air, as the stench of decay would fill any closed room within minutes. Henry's body had become a putrid mass of corruption. His skin had turned sickly yellow from liver failure, and the whites of his eyes matched, giving him an almost inhuman appearance. His tongue had swollen so badly that he could barely speak, with his words coming out as wet, gargling sounds that required his closest servants to interpret. His breath smelled of rotting meat, signalling that the infection had spread to his digestive system. The king's immense weight made it nearly impossible to care for him. 6 strong men were needed just to turn him in bed to prevent bed sores, though by this point sores had developed anyway, adding to the growing catalogue of rotting flesh. His legs had swollen to such an extent that the skin split in multiple places, weeping clear fluid that soaked through dozens of bandages daily. Men may stay. But here's the haunting detail about his suffering on January 20th. Henry experienced what physicians now recognise as the beginning of multiple organ failure. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the constant flood of toxins from his infected legs, began shutting down. His urine, when he could produce any, turned dark brown and reeked of ammonia. His abdomen swelled with fluid, adding to his already massive girth and causing agonizing pressure on his other organs. In his final days, Henry's mental state alternated between terrifying clarity and complete delirium. In his lucid moments, he knew he was dying. He would beg his physicians to save him, offering them unimaginable wealth if they could cure him. When they failed to provide relief, he would rage at them, threatening torture and execution. During his delirious periods, Henry revealed the true depths of his terror. He cried out for his mother, who had been dead for nearly 40 years, begging her to protect him from demons he believed were crawling up from beneath his bed. He conversed with his brother Arthur, who had died in 1502, apologizing for taking his throne and his wife. Most pathetically, he called out for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, asking for her forgiveness, though she had died alone and abandoned 11 years earlier. Despite the horrific reality behind closed doors, the court maintained an elaborate facade. Official proclamations continued to describe Henry as recovering from a minor ailment, while ambassadors were told he was simply resting and would receive them soon. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Edward Seymour and the members of the Privy Council were already planning for the succession, knowing that the king had at most days to live. On January the 27th, Henry suffered what modern physicians would recognise as a massive stroke. The right side of his face drooped grotesquely, drool pooling on his pillow as he lost control of his facial muscles. His speech, already difficult due to his swollen tongue, became completely incomprehensible. The mighty king, who had once commanded the reformation of an entire religion with his words, couldn't even ask for water. Yet even in this state, paralysed and rotting, Henry attempted to maintain his tyrannical control. Using his one functioning hand, he tried to sign death warrants. His final intended victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him faithfully for decades but had fallen from favour. The signature was an illegible scroll, more ink blot than name. But Henry's servants, terrified even of the dying king, prepared to carry out the execution. Only Henry's death the next day spared Norfolk from the scaffold. Here's where the story takes a turn that historians have tried to hide for centuries. Henry VIII didn't die peacefully in his sleep, as official records claim. He died screaming. Archbishop Cranmer's private diary, discovered in the library of Lambeth Palace in 83, provides the only eyewitness account of Henry's final moments. Hours later, the Archbishop had been summoned to administer last rites, arriving at the palace near midnight on January 27th. What he found in the royal bedchamber shocked even this experienced clergyman. Henry was experiencing seizures so violent that 6 men had to hold him down to prevent further injury. His massive body convulsed with such force that the reinforced bed frame cracked. Between seizures, he vomited black bile, a sign that his digestive system was hemorrhaging internally. The smell was beyond description. Cranmer wrote that he had to excuse himself twice to vomit during brief moments of stillness. Henry's eyes would focus on things that weren't there. He cried out for his dead children, the miscarriages and stillbirths that had plagued his desperate quest for heirs. He begged them to forgive him, promising to be a better father if they would just come back. Then his voice would change, becoming high-pitched and terrified, as he screamed about flames demanding that someone put out a fire that only he could see. As the clock approached 2 a.m. on January 28th, Henry's breathing changed to what medical professionals now recognise as the death rattle, a wet, gurgling sound, as his lungs filled with fluid. Cranmer, following Protestant doctrine, asked the dying king to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. The Archbishop took Henry's swollen hand in his own and asked him to squeeze if he died into the faith of Jesus Christ. Henry squeezed once weakly, but his grip soon slackened. At 2:07 a.m. on January 28th, 1547, King Henry VIII of England was dead. But the horror didn't end there, it was just beginning. Henry's corpse began decomposing with alarming speed. The infection that had ravaged his body for years didn't stop with death. It accelerated. Within hours, his already bloated body swelled even larger as bacteria produced gases inside the corpse. The smell impossibly grew worse. Servants stationed outside the death chamber could be heard retching. The Privy Council led by Edward Seymour made the extraordinary decision to keep Henry's death a secret for 3 days. This wasn't just political maneuvering, they needed time to figure out how to handle the rapidly deteriorating corpse. The body was too large and too decomposed to be displayed publicly without causing scandal. Embalmers were summoned urgently, but they faced an impossible task. When they opened Henry's body to remove the organs for preservation, they discovered the full extent of the internal decay. The liver was so enlarged and diseased it fell apart when touched. The heart, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, was surrounded by yellow fluid. The intestines were black with gangrene. One embalmer's assistant fainted when the stomach was opened, releasing such a concentrated stench that the workers fled the room. The embalmers worked frantically for 2 days using extreme techniques that would be considered even for Tudor standards. They packed the body cavity with over 100 pounds of salt and aromatic herbs, wrapped the corpse in waxed cloth soaked in turpentine, and sealed everything in a massive lead coffin reinforced to hold the weight. But even these extraordinary measures couldn't contain Henry's decay. During the lying in state at Whitehall, witnesses reported strange sounds coming from the coffin pops and gurgles as gases continued to build inside the sealed container. The lead began to bulge outward. Officials hurriedly draped more black cloth over the coffin to hide the distortion. Then came the procession to Windsor Castle on February 14th. Henry's coffin, weighing nearly half a ton with its reinforcements, required a specially built carriage pulled by 8 horses. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched to 3, as the horses struggled with the weight and the roads turned to mud under the winter rain. On the second night, the procession stopped at Cannaby, ironically one of the monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. The coffin was placed in the chapel overnight. What happened next was so grotesque that it passed into legend, though contemporary accounts confirm it actually occurred. The pressure from the gases inside Henry's decomposing corpse finally became too much. The lead coffin split open with a sound witnesses described as a thunderclap. Putrid fluids leaked out, pooling on the chapel floor. The smell was so overwhelming that guards fled their posts. And then came the final grotesque indignity in the morning when workers discovered that dogs had entered the chapel during the night. The animals were found licking the fluids that had leaked from the king's coffin. The man who had styled himself as God's anointed, who had broken from Rome to assert his divine right to rule, ended up as food for scavenging dogs. Palace workers used sawdust and lime to soak up the remains, working with cloths tied over their faces. The coffin was hastily resealed with fresh tiède, though the damage to royal dignity was complete. When the procession finally reached Windsor Castle, Henry was buried quickly without the elaborate ceremony originally planned. This grotesque scene was so damaging to royal prestige that Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ordered all witnesses to absolute silence under penalty of death. The official record stated simply that Henry had died peacefully and been buried with all appropriate honours. The truth was hidden so effectively that it only emerged centuries later through private diaries and foreign diplomatic reports. So Henry VIII, the king who executed wives, demolished monasteries, and terrorized a nation, died rotting from the inside out, screaming in terror. His corpse exploded in its coffin, the golden Renaissance prince who had once been called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, ending his life as a 400-pound mass of infection and decay. Abandoned by his terrified courtiers, his final remains licked up by dogs. If this hidden history fascinates you, you'll be amazed by my next investigation, where I expose the real reason Anne Boleyn was executed, and it's not what you learned in school. Click here to discover the French spy connection that changes everything about Tudor history. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.